between paying attention to something, being conscious of what you're paying attention to, especially when the content of that attentional state is internally generated. Oh my God, that sounds like a lot, but it's much simpler than what you think, or than what it sounds. So I'm going to spend the great majority of the time talking with you about a new model of mental imagery. Somehow there's something that needs to be done. And then we're going to wrap this thing together and start a little bit of conversation. But first, I'm going to ask you to really experience what a mental image is by doing this with me. Please close your eyes and keep them closed. Now keep them closed and think about Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Keep them closed. So is she looking at you or not? And now, is her hair curled or straight? Now you can open your eyes again, and just, if you want, unmute and tell me, is Mona Lisa looking at you or not? Don't Google it yet. I saw you were Googling.
I felt like she was looking at me, but I always feel like paintings are looking at me. So I don't know if that's just a personal.
That's another part of the manual. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so, and Catherine. Catherine is your name, right?
Yes.
Or Catherine. Where is Catherine? Is her Mona Lisa's hair curled or straight?
Straight, I think.
Right, right. So there she is, looking at you, not so much. Hair curled or straight, mostly straight. So, but if you forget about Mona Lisa for a second and you think what you did psychologically, as you were trying to play this game with me, you really had to do a lot of things. You had to first go into your memory and find a picture of Mona Lisa. If you don't have it, there's nothing to play with. Then become conscious of that image, really kind of generate it and maintain it right in front of your eyes, being conscious of Mona Lisa. And third thing, pay attention to it, scan it to see, okay, let me focus on the eyes. How are the eyes doing? Looking at me or not? And now hair. So you did a lot of things. So how about we try it again? Close your eyes and think about Mona Lisa. Is she looking at you or not? Is her hair curled or straight? Open your eyes and answer to the two prompts again. What do you think? Tori, is Mona Lisa looking at you or not?
Yes, she is looking at you.
Lori, I just saw your camera. And hi there. Never turn on the camera. You know you're going to be on the spotlight. Never, ever. Now you all learned this. I'm kidding. So is Mona Lisa hair curled or straight?
I think my answer to both questions is similar. It depends on my frame of mind, particularly with, is she looking at you or not? I mean, her two eyes are sort of looking in different places. And if I can, it depends how I'm looking at her, or it depends upon how I'm feeling. And I can make them go back and forth. But that I felt stronger about than the hair.
That's absolutely great. And it's exactly the point of what mental imagery is all about, meaning the fact that somehow we have to come up with all the info makes that info more prone to distortions, changes, variations that we use a term that is called vividness of a mental image, right? So clearly a mental image is rarely as vivid as a actual image right in front of you. Somehow we can use this dramatic example of a person trying to restore ecce homo by just using house cleaning products because they thought that there was dust on top of the painting and they sprayed with Windex and they tried to clean it, resulting in, kind of the loss of the rightmost figure is the current state of ecce homo, the leftmost is how it was at the beginning. But somehow this figure, I think, represents really the quality of mental images, right? So mental images looks very much like the one on the right, or at best, the middlemost image. Very rarely mental images look like the one on the left panel, right? Meaning mental images are never as vivid as actually perceived object. Now, why am I spending so much time on this? Because somehow we want to preserve this quality of mental images, not being identical to perception. Why? Because if mental images are as vivid as perceived objects, then what is reality? Then I cannot distinguish anymore between, is this Mona Lisa in front of me or not? If we move this to the extreme, this is what some people with post-traumatic stress disorder say. Mental images, imagined content, seems as vivid as perceived content, which is very important. It tells us that we don't want mental images to be as clear, as strong as perceived objects. So there is a component of subjective experience of mental images that distorts it, that blurs it, right? And mental imagery means generating content from long-term memory, right? Kind of opening the spotlight. And if I tell, for example, Ashley, hi there, you just joined us. I have a question for you already, which is, close your eyes and think about a red apple. Now open your eyes and tell us subjectively, what did you experience? What happened in your brain? What happened in your mind?
Well, my mind was pretty blank beforehand, and I guess I thought of a red apple. And then I tried to think of some details about it. So in my head, it was not perfect. It was kind of speckled and had some spots and imperfections. That's all.
So this is exactly, thank you, Ashley. Sorry for poking at you, but Drew, you're up next, right? So, so again, imagining something kind of creates this, and now this is a basic keynote animation, but this feeling of it starts from one point and then it spreads and fills in some details, like Ashley was perfectly describing, and it's not like having Mona Lisa in front of you. So generating from the long-term memory is one part, but then you need a mechanism to sustain that image over time, right? You need a mechanism that will keep that image right in front of you so that you can kind of explore, is she looking at me? How about her hands? Hair curled or straight, and so on. So we need something that will keep the image available for X amount of time. And then decision-making, right? Something that is not about mental imagery per se. This is the same decision-making you do for, do I want an apple or a banana? Am I thirsty? Or do I want some coffee? So this is a process unrelated to mental imagery. But you often use mental images to do something. One way we use mental imagery is parking your car. Do I fit into the spot? Parallel parking. You get there. If some of you have a driver's license, you get there and you say, do I fit? Like, how big is my car? Is that space enough? And this is exactly a mental rotation task that we use every time we want to park a car. We need to transform and see if this size fits into that other size. So why am I spending so much time on this? Because you might have read in the textbook the leading model of mental imagery, right? Which is a model that started with fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, late in the 90s, and then 2000 with Koslin. It's called Koslin model. Koslin is a Harvard professor that somehow identified how there is a great deal of overlap in the brain regions we use to imagine things compared to the brain regions we use to actually see things. Meaning, in other words, imagery and perception are using the same neural substrate, meaning they are using the same brain regions, just in a reversed hierarchy. What does it mean? Perception starts from your visual perception, for example, starts from your visual cortex in the back of your brain, the occipital lobe. And that visual information that comes from the retina activates other areas of the brain, right? If I can draw on this slide, for example, it starts from here, right? My eyes are here. The information goes into the occipital lobe and where my visual cortex is, and then the information gets, relayed forward, right? This is what perception looks like. Now, according to the leading model of mental imagery, imagination is just the opposite. It starts from a command. I want to imagine an apple. And in a top-down mechanism, goes and activates areas that are lower level, visual areas. You see, again, this kind of reversed hierarchy, right? From bottom-up perception to top-down imagery. But the areas are the same according to the model, right? So 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's just a reversed pattern. Turns out that this model that has been in the textbooks for so long is wrong, is incorrect. And how can I say that this is incorrect? Because for over 30 years or more, we know that patients with a lesion to the visual cortex or patients with a complete bilateral resection of the occipital lobe due to tumors lose perception, but they still have mental imagery. So this area is not needed for mental imagery, because if you don't have it anymore, you still can imagine things. I'll repeat this because it sounds beyond, but neuroscience started with Broca area, with observing the direct relationship between the absence of a region and the absence of a function. Broca area, language production. You don't have Broca area anymore. You don't have language production anymore. This is true also here, meaning it should be true also here. You don't have visual cortex anymore. You don't have imagination anymore. But that's not what happens. Patients with complete bilateral resection of the occipital lobe for surgical reasons, for therapeutic reasons, do not perceive anything anymore. but they do preserve their mental imagery capabilities. So that model must be revised. One thing more, animals are good at mental imagery. You may not believe it, but pigeons are super good at mentally rotating stuff, meaning they can tell you this one, which one is it like, right? They can tell you if you just rotate a test item and you say, which one is it? Well, this is like this one. It's just rotated 90 degrees. So they can rotate stimuli to identify which one is the visual object in front of them. And monkeys are perfectly able to imagine how a sad face looks like. So this is not humans are special because we are imagination. Like we used to say, humans are special because we have language. No, this is a function that we have developed over many, many, many thousands of years. And I'm going to pause 1 second before I spoil another thing, and I'm going to ask you, do you have any question about this? How is this going? Are we following? We're good? All right. Because instead, if you lose one part of the brain, you will lose the ability to imagine. So don't lose that part of the brain, please, because it's very, very, very painful to lose the ability to imagine yourself. And this has been shown just last year, by a Finnish group who studied an architect, 55 years old architect, who got a brain lesion in this very small area in the temporal lobe and could not perform his work anymore. Because being an architect means a lot of, can I put it there? Okay, let's do the ceiling this way and the wall here. And how do you do it if you cannot imagine things anymore? So the guy, the architect in question, could work if he used a computer in front of him. Like if he used a computer to visualize the things that he could not imagine anymore. But he couldn't do by mind, right? He couldn't imagine the red apple that Ashley imagined earlier. He couldn't imagine if Mona Lisa had her hair curled or straight. Needless to say, this area is not here, but this area is here. You don't need the visual cortex to imagine things. But if you lose part of your temporal lobe, a part of the brain that sits next to your memory system, then you are not able to imagine things anymore. In a recent article, I reviewed the literature, the fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging literature, to look if we could find some sort of match with what these people were saying in Finland with this architect who lost the ability to imagine, and the fMRI literature. And the article looks like this. So I'm going to summarize it for you because you don't really want to read papers that look like this. Trust me, it's a lot of and very boring. So I'm going to summarize it in a few words for you by saying that we reviewed as much literature on mental imagery as there was. We overlapped on the brain all the various results from this article. So this really took us going into the article, finding the small table where they tell you, we found this region, and compile all the literature by putting in a gigantic Excel file and saying, this article found this small region, for example, here. This article found this, and so on. This is what is called a meta-analysis, an analysis of existing results, right? and so on. And actually, what we found out is that we have something that we call the Fusiform imagery node, the same region that the architect lost, right, is actually the most consistent finding in recent imaging literature, a region in the temporal lobe, sitting next to the hippocampus, sitting next to these places where we store information, and that is needed that seems to be like the the region connecting, long-term memory with frontal lobe functions, right? That region that when we say you need something to find the red apple in your long-term memory, this is what maybe this region is doing. Interestingly, this region was somehow found in another article by in an article by Lawrence and colleagues, researchers in Germany, which did a cytoarchitectural study of the fusiform gyrus. Lots of complicated words, just to say that they identified subregions within this macro area that we call the fusiform gyrus, and identified a spot that is very similar to what we found. You can see it down here in this other image, how what we call the fusiform gyrus is actually can be parcellated. This is the term we use, can be split into smaller and smaller and smaller regions. And it seems to be doing other things. Our region, the region I found, seems to be more or less this. Okay, this is maybe too much detail, right? But what I'm trying to say is that there is one small part of the fusiform gyrus that seems to be the region that if you have a lesion that includes that part of the brain, you're going to lose the ability to imagine things, at least visual imagination. Then, in this same article, we found no evidence of early visual cortex activation. So by compiling all the studies and putting them together and say, okay, give me a map that is not the result of one manipulation of one study, but give me the result of these 27 studies that I found. There's nothing going on in the visual cortex. Only 5, 6 out of 27 actually found visual cortex activation. Just for those less familiar with visual cortex, this is not visual cortex, this is visual cortex, right? This is an area that is called PCC, precuneus posterior cingulate cortex, which may be actually associated with mentation, right? With the default mode network, right? When you imagine something, you are somehow thought processing or thinking through things. Anyway, so once again, a region of the temporal lobe is activated, visual cortex is not activated. Well, if we stop at here, we have no scientific relevance. This is not a scientific result. Why is it not? Because we know that fMRI is a correlational method, and the absence of something in your result doesn't mean that that region is not activated in reality. It means that maybe you had no power to detect it, your study was not well done, and so on. So one thing that we say more and more is you should not make conclusions on a null result, right? You should not make conclusion about an absent of something, right? Unless you use this new set of statistical methodology, which are called Bayesian methods, statistical inference methods, which has been around for a lot, but in neuroscience it's fairly new. Unless you use Bayesian methods to examine whether you can find activation or not in a region. And if you don't find it, you have evidence for the absence of that thing, right? So somehow now using Bayesian inference methods, you can interpret the absence of a result. There is no visual cortex activation associated with mental imagery, even if you use Bayesian inference methods, which makes me very happy because finally we are reconciling the neuropsychological literature that has been screaming at us using fMRI because we are cool and telling us, no, you don't need the visual cortex to imagine things. There's something wrong in your method. And third, of course, when I saw this map, I was like, oh my, I know these folks here. I suddenly met what I called an old friend, meaning that the results of this meta-analysis gave us 1, the Fusiform imagery node, 2, the absence of visual cortex activation, and then the attentional networks. The regions displayed here are what we call the frontoparietal and Cingulo-Opercular networks. Lots of terms just to say regions in the frontal lobe, in the parietal lobe, right? Also describes here, if you look at the brain from the top, right? And in the Cingulo-Opercular network, right? This is the CO, Cingulo-Opercular network. And this is what we call the FPN, right? These are the regions that have been found for 30 years associated with attention. From a gigantic article of Maurizio Corbetta in 2008, a proceeding of National Academy of Neuroscience article, to another article from Nico Dosenbach's work, and other recent literature I also co-authored. These regions are there every time you study attention. How are we doing up until now? I promise I'll tell you just a few more things and then I want to chat with you. So again, this brought me back. I wanted to study mental imagery. I ended up studying attention again, which was like, no, I want to get rid of this thing. I studied attention for 15 years. Stop it. But can you really study cognition without studying attention? Aren't we all the time asking our participants to pay attention to the screen because we're going to present stuff on the screen? So can I get rid of attention? It doesn't seem like, which is a little bit concerning, but so I ended up again looking into the studies of, so is attention a prerequisite of consciousness? Do we need attention to be conscious of something, whether it's an external stimulus? Mona Lisa, if you go to the Louvre in Paris, you have Mona Lisa in front of you. Do you need to pay attention to Mona Lisa to be conscious of it or not? And this is the big fight between 3 theories of consciousness. The first one saying that attention is needed to be conscious, and only when you are conscious you can make decision making. While other theories say, no way, if you are an unconscious subject, like in a vegetative state, you are not going to be able to pay attention to things. So consciousness precedes attention. Or a third theory saying, well, decision-making is affected both by consciousness and by attention, but consciousness is more important to decision-making than attention. I know it sounds a lot. We don't have to learn all this right now. But what I'm trying to say is that I suddenly found myself, while attempting to study mental imagery, I find myself again meddling into this new question, this question that has been there forever, which is, what is the relationship between attention and consciousness? So I'm going to ask you to piece it together. Because if I look at the mental imagery network and at the imagery or the endogenous orienting network, meaning the attentional network as it's mostly has been described a lot, and I look at them and I keep staring at them, well, they are the same thing. They are the same, but for one thing, attention doesn't need the mental imagery node. You don't need imagination to pay attention to things. But if you want to pay attention to something that is internally generated, then you need a brain region that goes and interfaces with your long-term memory and say, red apple, how is a prototypical red apple? Or how big is this car? Can I put it into the spot? Or the sunset I saw 2 years ago during my vacation, or anything. The difference between mental imagery and attention is that mental imagery has some content. Attention is contentless. Attention needs to be filled. It's an empty bucket that you need to put something in to pay attention to it. For the rest, we are talking about the same neural substrate. So, generating from long-term memory, Mona Lisa, well, medial temporal lobe areas, our fusiform imagery node, our hippocampus, and our anterior temporal lobe regions for eye level, for filling in the information. But this is how Mona Lisa looks like, maintaining the information, right, is what you do with attention and working memory brain regions, right? If I tell you, let's see, Drew, my phone number is 718-123-4567. Can you repeat it, please?
718-123-4567.
You have the ability to keep things, to maintain things available for a certain amount of time. And that's what working memory and attention do, right? They make you focus on something and keep it sustained over time so you can explore it, try to learn it. Drew, what is my phone number?
718-123-4567.
So that thing is still there, it's still accessible. You can maintain things over time. Maybe tomorrow Drew will not even remember my face, right? Because that thing is gone. And then I'm going to ask you to talk with me about this. So now that we have started to understand how mental imagery works and revised Koslin's model for something that is reconciling with the neuropsychological literature, because I want to go beyond, and this is already big field, but of course I don't want to stop just because I'm too curious for this. I'm going to ask you to discuss with me and think with me about two future directions. The first one is, what is the role of mental imagery in stereotypes formation? What is a stereotype? And if I tell you, think about, I don't know, anything, right? Any personal, you come up with some sort of image. What is the relationship between these two things? We didn't study, but maybe, and I want to hear all of you telling me the solution to my next grant, possibly, which is, maybe people with greater mental imagery, meaning people that experience imagination as very vivid, also tend to produce very strong stereotypes. Or maybe the opposite. The fact that you have so little imagination makes you lump things together in what a stereotype is, which is a simplification, biased simplification of something that you cannot imagine complex, right? So, okay, this thing is prototypically like this. So what is the relationship between stereotypes and mental imagery? And why am I asking this question? Because we want to get rid of stereotypes, right? Stereotypes are not helpful, or predictions that we can't get rid of, but we should get rid of. And they are sticky, right? Even if I think that I'm a very, very open-minded person, I have a progressive political attitude, I feel the stickiness of the stereotypes, right? And why are they so sticky? Is it because I'm not as good as mental imagery? Or is it because I'm too good at mental images, right? That I live my life in this, I rely a lot on mental imagery. Ooh, sorry. And then the next thing that I want to discuss with you, which is, it's gonna come, this is like the, don't worry. This is the same slide as before. I see you're all panicking, but don't worry, it's the same. Which is, so what is the role of mental imagery in predicting your future and having a satisfactory and successful life? Because somehow, if I want to imagine my, come on, this is what I tell all of you students that come to my office hours. I tell you, well, imagine where you want to be in 5 years, like what you want to do, Viviana. And but actually, I'm asking you to do something that I don't know if you're super good at. Can you imagine things? Because I give it for granted, but actually, there's a lot of people, and I invite you to join their Facebook group if you have Facebook, that they say that they are aphantastics. I'm gonna write it down because you sorry, there you go. They say that they are aphantastics. They don't imagine things. When you ask them, close your eyes and think about a red apple, they tell you, I see nothing. What are you talking about? And people with aphantasia live a super happy life. And they discover that they have aphantasia at 30, 40, 50, when disturbed by these people saying that they kind of actually see things. When you ask them to imagine something, they raise their hand and say, but it's not literal, right? Like you're not really seeing something, right? Like you say you see the red apple, but you don't see the red apple. And people say, no, I see the red apple. I see Mona Lisa. And they say, well, yes, meaning you know what Mona Lisa is, but you don't see Mona Lisa when you close your eyes. And no, I see Mona Lisa. I see some version of Mona Lisa. But people with aphantasia don't see or subjectively report to have no imagination. So what is the role of imagery when I ask you, where do you want to be in the future? Imagine yourself in 5 years, Julia. What do you want to do? Do you want to be a pre-med student? Like, well, Julia has to think about it, has to imagine themselves into a position in the future. But that imagination is not for granted. It's not to be taken for granted. It's something that we don't know how it works very much, but needs to be studied. Okay. So I want to acknowledge all the people that are, I'm not doing this by myself at all. There is a lot of work that is being put on this work that I'm doing. And I want to discuss with you now with this, when we talk about being paying attention to something, being conscious of something, imagining something, of what and how do we achieve these scopes? I'm going to do 2 plugs now. One, we're organizing a play about social justice and racial bias that exactly discusses also mental imagery on the 28th. So please, tickets are free, but please come visit. The second thing is, if you want to know more about neuroscience of consciousness, I have a course at Columbia University that exactly tries to go as deep as possible on what we know, at least, which is little, about what it means to be conscious of something. All right. Okay, 2 plugs. I know. I told you, I advise you, but please, what do you think about these 2 questions? If you have questions for me, it's fine. But I have 2 questions for you. What do you think? And thank you for listening to this. It was very long. Tori, go ahead.
Sure. So as far as the mental imagery with stereotype formation, that made me think of cognitive linguistics. Specifically, there's one researcher, George Lakoff, I believe is how you pronounce his last name, and he wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, and how we use cognitive linguistics to frame the pictures and political messaging in particular, which goes very much hand in hand with stereotype formation. So I think there's a lot of crossover with linguistics in this too. I don't have a particular opinion in general as the role of this in stereotype formation, but as far as something to explore further, I would definitely look into that. Very
interesting. You know what happened? It turns out that our Fusiform imagery node, so this is, your point is perfectly on spot. You know who is, it's sitting right next to a brain region that we call the visual word form area. The area of the brain that activates when you see the word, I don't know, Diet Coke, or when you see the word red apple. So again, we are inferior temporal lobe stuff, right? So your point is perfectly right, perfectly right. What is the role of language? The imagination is built on top of it for sure, part of it at least. Magdalena, I saw you joining us. And may I ask you a question? Yes. And the question is, I'm sorry, I poke on people, and if you have your camera on, if you don't, I usually don't bother. So now you know, and you should never turn on your camera. Anyway, so the question is, what do you think? Do you think that people with stereotypes that tend to live a life by stereotypes, right? That tends to stereotype everything. Do you think that they have a lot of imagery or little imagery?
Little. To me, they have little because they just have the stereotype, and they don't make an effort to change the image or the appreciation of someone else or something else.
Right. That's where I tend to go, but I also, thank you, Magdalena. That's where I tend to go, but I also can see why you need somehow a lot of imagination to create that strong stereotype, right? That stereotypes, you know, it needs to be created, and it needs imagination, you know, and the stronger it is, the more you kind of wrapped it on extra layers of something. So I tend to be, I agree with you, Magdalena, but I also see this other part of the story, and I cannot get an Leah, did you raise your Zoom? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Magdalena, go ahead.
But if it's something that I've been influenced, probably if I stereotype myself, I mean, find that kind of because of the environment, the media, every information is given to you. Then
right.
you know, you have a pre image of everything, or a
Right.
perception of things. Now, if it's me, okay, but if you have it like that influence,
Right.
it's you who has to make the effort to change it. But if I'm not strong enough, or if I like to feel like that, so I guess little by little, my thinking, my critical thinking, and my imagination, it's like fading. So I'm
right.
That's what I think.
Right. It makes sense. Meaning you're perfectly right in this describing the dissociation between these two things, right? Meaning sometimes we form stereotype because we're not even thinking about it. We are fed some sort of
yes.
narrative of information, and then I don't even think about imagining different scenarios, right? Or why that person did something, or so that's absolutely a very, very important point. That's great. Leah, thank you.
Yes, that's Leah.
Leah, what do you think? How are you?
Hi, I'm good. So I'm just thinking that I really like this discussion approach to brainstorming ideas, because I really sincerely believe that all of us is more than one of us, and that together we can make quicker advances in our fields by collaborating and exploring all ideas. Because if you're just going the old-fashioned, isolated, alone person in a tower somewhere studying something, it's not really going to help the world at all. And so we need to work together to find solutions. And I think that for some cultures that are very individualistic in their political and economic systems, this makes us be competitive with each other. And that hurts our ultimate goal of knowledge and learning, and hopefully making the world a better place, even though it might sound silly, right? Better than before, maybe better than we found it. So my idea is that stereotypes are so strong in controlling people's worldview, controlling their behavior, controlling how they treat people. But I think it's an evolutionary survival mechanism that has been manipulated by politicians, by people that run our economic systems, and the whole superstructure is expressing these things that shape us. And so I think if it's an evolutionary tendency that's being manipulated, it's a survival skill, because you don't want to die. You don't want to get decapitated, you don't want to be captured or tortured or kidnapped, right? So you have to have some ideas on how to be safe in the world. And so I think that the indoctrination that we're seeing more often around us, like QAnon and the whole Trump cult, there's cult behavior happening, and people's stereotypes are being manipulated by politicians, by people that control our economy. And right now it's getting to an extreme point, because our structures, our cultural and economic structures, have been imbalanced in favor of the pursuit of profit. And I think it's making our society more weak. And
right. Thank you so much for that. I agree on one part, especially on one part, which is, I don't know if that somehow stereotypes are, that there is a mechanism behind stereotypes formation, which is not stereotyped, but that is evolutionarily better to have, like that we developed it because we need to be quickly interpreting reality, right? So there is something of, not of stereotype, but of the previous level of stereotypes, which helps us predicting what the future is going to be, and whether I should, be aware of that person or be friendly with that person. Why are you asking me if I have a minute for, right? So there is an evolutionary advantage of trying to predict the future and behavior and situations and stuff, but that mechanism can be twisted to create stereotypes and right, everybody can access and twist that mechanism.
But excuse me, I don't think I answered your actual question. That was a different question, I think. And what I really wanted to say is that, so the hypothesis about, is it connected to the visual part, the part of our brain that generates images? Because sometimes every time you hear a word, you might see the letters in your mind of some language or multiple languages, or you might like have a sensation, or you might see a color, or you might like see nothing, you might feel something. And so the way our brain, especially on the topic of concussions and traumatic brain injuries, it can find a way to connect in a new way to help people. It's plastic, as I think you were saying. So I don't know if the right question is it connected to the visual part? Although it'd be really interesting to find out more information about that. But the other part is it something that is a survival skill, but when it's twisted and manipulated, it turns us against each other. So it wasn't, developed with a purpose, but when it's manipulated with a purpose, that's when it's bad for society.
Right. Lori, did I see you raising your hand? Go ahead.
You did.
Thank you.
First of all, I think this is a really fascinating discussion. It makes you wrap your head around things differently. You sort of just put your finger on what I was thinking, which is that, isn't it human nature to discern patterns? And when you asked Drew to remember your phone number, I thought, of course he remembered your phone number because it's the first 7 numbers. I mean, 718 is a local area code, but nonetheless, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I could remember that tomorrow, the next day. So in fact, it wasn't necessarily about attention in a way. It's because something we've learned and it's a pattern we know. So,
Right. The example was very simple.
Right. No, but it's more than simple. It's that pattern of how you have to work harder when you're a child than you do mentally than you do when you're adult, because what you were saying, evolutionarily, you take this stuff in and you learn how to interpret it. But it also has to do, I think, with stereotyping, because stereotyping is also making predictions, and in that way of what you already know and what you have in your head, these patterns. But it also makes it unnecessary to pay attention. So if something, by having a stereotype or having a pattern in your head, you don't have to pay attention at all, actually. So I think, I can't remember who was discussing something like this about whether it's good or bad or it shows attention or not. But I think it causes a lack of need to pay attention. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So being being stereotypes a shortcut, they also need less, they also take less load, less attentional, right.
But also what Leah was saying about bringing it back to brain injury is brain injury of any kind often, I would say most of the time, causes an inability to focus or pay attention. So being scattered, everything scattered, you can't make patterns, which is one of the reasons it's so hard for us to organize or whatever. So I don't know how that fits into what your question.
That is right. That is absolutely a super interesting point. So I know that there is a 5:35 other talks. I don't want to cut this too short, but that is absolutely a super important point, which is, well, then if you have a deficit of attention, or if your attention is less focused in certain scenarios, then what happens to your imagination and stereotype formation and so on. So that's a super point. Wow. Okay. Right. I took notes of all of this. I'm gonna do this because I know that we have to wrap up. So I'm gonna write my email address here in the chat, possibly correctly, so you actually can write to me. So please if you don't mind, let's keep this conversation going by email or by let's chat more about this. This sounds like super interesting points. And Tori, Annalise, I know that you had some questions. Yeah, email and let's chat more about this. Thank you so much for attending this talk. I hope that there was something interesting that kind of lead up a little bit of new info for you. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spagna. That was an incredible presentation, and I think it fostered a very incredible conversation. I think we'll all come from this and ask even more questions. Hopefully people continue to contact you and stay curious.
Too short.
Too short indeed. That's the flaw with this conference, I think, is that like everybody's presenting on such incredible topics that you just want to exhaust it. There's so much information. The brain is inexhaustible. So, the next speaker is Dr. Argawal. And that is at 5:45. I know for this meeting, we asked people to leave and then rejoin, but I'm waiting on the person that will be hosting that Zoom link.
So we have to leave or we can wait.
You could probably wait, honestly.
Okay.
I feel like that's easier.
I think I'm gonna wait. It's not too long. I'm gonna grab a glass of water.
Perfect.
Unmute myself.